Yeah, that's true, Tara. Not really early, but you didn't have any time to review the training kit unless you came earlier. So Sarah, you asked, does cascading matter in cases in reducer functions? I don't think, if I understand what you're asking, if cascading matters as in, does it go to other cases if one case matches? Nope, it doesn't, because once you return from a function, once you return from your reducer function, it's done running. It's never going to run again. Okay, so you don't have to worry about other cases that come after the case that matches. If that's what you're asking, if you want to clarify that anymore. The order that the case is called. As long as you're using unique action type names, then it shouldn't matter, because if you're using unique action types, then there's only going to be one match in your switch case. If you wanted to have it match more than one type, I guess you could, but that would take a little bit of extra knowledge as to how switch cases work. You just have to look that up. But you can have a switch match multiple cases at once. That's possible. But you should have unique type names. Is Redux a library or a data workflow? Both terms have been used to define Redux, but it only confuses me, Kimberly. Redux can be thought of as a very simple wrapper library around a common pattern. Okay, it's a helper library that helps force us into this pattern of functional programming and immutability. Okay, so Redux is the library. It could also kind of be thought of as the pattern, but the pattern is more based around something called Flux, which is what we're going to talk about tonight, something that we're going to talk about tonight. So Redux is just a really simple wrapper around a pattern. Okay, so it can kind of be thought of as both. Isn't user reducer easier and less complicated than Redux and with the same result? No, not always. We'll get into the differences tonight, but really it just comes down to a case-by-case basis, depending on what your project needs, depending on how complicated your code base is, how large your application is. Sometimes it makes sense to just not use anything, to just use raw, just use state from React, right? Not complicate your application with anything more complex than that. Sometimes it makes sense to just use context, maybe just context side by side with use state, nothing else, if you just have a really small application. Maybe you have like a semi-large application where it doesn't necessarily warrant something as complicated as Redux, but maybe you still want to use a reducer. And I mean, in that case, you could use the user reducer hook alongside maybe the context API and kind of do it that way. But once we start to get into these really large applications that have really complex state trees, it makes sense to use a library like Redux to help us organize our code. Okay, otherwise it's really difficult to keep it organized. Can you go over the dispatch part of the last project? People defined variables to get around it, but you didn't do it in the lecture, just dispatches, so I was confused. Whoever asked that question, I'm not totally sure what it is you're asking. So obviously when we use the reuse reducer hook, we get that dispatch function. Dispatch can kind of just be thought of as kind of kicking off like a state change, right? It's saying, take this action object that I'm going to give you, send it to the reducer, and kind of kick off the state change, right? And that triggers a state change to go through the reducer and return new state and set that state through React. So it kept saying the case wasn't defined. So in that case, maybe you had like a typo in your action type, possibly. Yeah, if you have a follow-up question with that, please ask it. We'll go over dispatch a little bit again tonight when we get into Redux, if that will help clear it up a little bit as to what it's doing behind the hood. Okay. Okay. So quick review. What is immutability? How would you define immutability? It's something that can't change, right? It's unchangeable data. Data that doesn't mutate over time. Once it's defined, it's set in stone. Why is immutability useful? Why is it useful for us to code in these immutable patterns? So we don't overwrite stuff, right? So it's more predictable, easier to debug. Remember, mutation hides change. So once an object is mutated or once a value is mutated, the original value is gone. Okay, we can't revert back to that original value. We can't see it, can't do anything with it, it's just gone. So when we're working with immutable code, we can still access that original value. If we need to debug something or if we need to access it, maybe reset a form or something like that, we can still access that original value. Because we instead of changing the value, we copied it and maybe changed something on the copy, right? So it allows us to debug easier. Yep, Michael, it allows us to backtrack. It's just a lot more predictable, right? So how does React force us into an immutable pattern? What are some things that React does that forces us into this pattern of immutability? Robert, you got more bugs with the reducer? Maybe those bugs were there all along and the reducer allowed you to catch those bugs. Yeah, exactly. Dallas, Stephen, when we use React, we can't just change the state directly, right? Because nothing will happen. React doesn't know about those changes. So React kind of forces us into this immutable pattern of if we want to change some state value, we have to go through the setter, right? If we're using the use reducer, we have to go through the reducer. We have to dispatch an action if we want to change something, or we have to call set state. We have to basically call something with a copy of the object in order to change the state. React doesn't just allow us to change the state directly. Or when we're talking about props, for example, props are read-only, right? You can't change props once they get passed to a component. In order to change props, you have to go through a setter function that comes through a parent, right? So React kind of forces us into this immutable pattern. Cool. So what are the different ways that we've learned so far that allow us to handle state within our application? What are the different ways that we have handled state so far? Okay, so we got use state. Obviously, that's just the very basic one, comes from React by default, use state. We've got the context API that allows us to make our state a little bit more global and accessible in deeply nested components. Right, and then we've got our use reducer, which is kind of a wrapper on top of use state that allows us to use reducer functions to change our state. When are each of these methods appropriate to use? When would we pick one or the other? What does it kind of depend on? Yeah, I mean, it really just depends on the size and the complexity of your app, right? You don't want to make your code base too complex if you're just coding a really, really simple application. So React kind of gives us this ability to choose how complex our state management is based on how complex our state is. If we have simple state, we can use simple state management. If we have complex state, we have to use complex state management. Cool. So what is a reducer? How would we define a reducer? Okay, so a reducer is a pure function. What does it take in as its parameters? Right, it takes in some state and some action, some state and an action, right? And then it clones that state and it makes a change to it, makes a change to the clone based on the action. It does what the action tells it to do, then it returns that new state. Okay, that's all a reducer does, just a pure function. No magic behind the scenes, that's it. All right, what is the action? What's an action? An action could describe any kind of event, right? But essentially it's just an object. An action is just a plain old JavaScript object that we pass through to the reducer. Okay, and it has a couple keys in it that we define. Are the keys, the key names that we define in our action object, are those strict? Like, do we have to call them type and payload, or do we have a little bit of flexibility there? Nope, not required. It's just convention, all right? It's convention to call our action types. It's convention to have the keys be type and that to be a string describing the action type, and then a payload that has some kind of value related to the action, right? It's just convention to name it type and action. Convention. Okay, and now that we're starting to get into Redux, it's a little bit more important as to whether we call it type and action or type and payload and something else. So it's important to kind of follow that convention, or you might mess things up as you go along. So you can call it whatever you want. Remember, your action is just an object that describes your action. You can call the keys whatever you want, but you should try and follow the convention so you don't confuse yourself and other developers that work on your code. Cool. So let's get into Redux. So React is really good at one thing. We've probably found this as we've gone through a lot of this content. React is really good at building user interfaces through these component trees, right? It's not that great at handling complex state, handling routing, basically all these other features that go into building an application. It's not that great at all of that stuff, which is why we need to use these third-party libraries like React Router and Redux. We have to use all of these third-party libraries to kind of build out a complete app. React is really good at just kind of the view piece of your application, but we have to bring in these other libraries to help with the rest. Okay, so since our state hasn't really been too complex yet, handling it with plain React really hasn't been that bad. It's been fine. But as our apps continue to grow and get more complicated, so does our data and so does our state. So we need to start looking at third-party libraries to help with this. You might not see the benefit of using these libraries while you're in Lambda school because your state's probably not going to get super complex on the stuff that you work on. But once you get into the field and you start working on real production apps, you're going to see that state gets really complex really quickly. And it really helps a lot to to know how to use these helper libraries, to know these patterns and frameworks that help us organize our complex state. So you've probably noticed that building out really well-designed React apps, it requires a lot of forethought and a lot of planning. It's not always clear which components should have state, which components should be pure, where your state should go, so on and so forth. And this is where Redux comes in to help. So Redux is really, when it comes down to it, it's just a third-party library. It's some code that someone else wrote that we can install through NPM that helps us with complex state management. All right. And it's one of many different approaches. It's important to know there's a lot of different approaches and a lot of different patterns and libraries that we can use to solve this problem of complex state management. But Redux right now is one of the most used. All right. It's one of the most popular ones out there at the moment, which is why we're teaching it. But there's a lot of different patterns that if you're interested in learning about the different patterns and ideas behind complex state management, you can go read about different ones. But Redux is the most popular. All right, so it's based on a pattern developed by Facebook a couple years ago called Flux. Has anybody ever heard of Flux? Essentially, when Facebook realized that complex state management is really, really difficult, they published this pattern called Flux, but it was really difficult to implement and it was really, really confusing. All right, I'll send you a link of the documentation if you're interested in reading about it. This is kind of where it all began, this idea of Flux, and they had a library that you could install that would help with it, and then a lot of other libraries started to come out that were based on this pattern of Flux. But it was really complicated to work with, and nobody really understood like how to implement it or how it was working. But it laid some great groundwork for other solutions to come along. Okay, the idea behind Flux was really solid. And it was really good. It was just difficult and confusing to implement. So a guy named Dan Abramov, you've probably heard of him, with inspiration from Flux and from other libraries and other languages, other implementations, he came up with this library of Redux. All right, so he kind of took this whole idea of Flux and he simplified it down to its very basics. And he created a library called Redux that was based on this idea. All right. And it blew up, like in popularity, it blew up really quickly, and he was hired by Facebook, and it kind of became a really widely adopted pattern in the community, this pattern of Redux. And that's kind of where we're at right now. Okay, Redux is really popular. The pattern of Redux is really popular. It might change later down the road. Redux might get phased out and get replaced by something else. But for now, Redux is what the community uses. This is kind of the pattern that everyone agreed on that was the best idea or the best way to structure our complex state. So it might change at some point, but for now, Redux is the main library used in the community, in the dev community. So it's important to note that Redux, it really doesn't have anything to do with React. Okay, it's a separate thing from React. Other than the fact that they work well together, there's really not that much in common between the two. Okay, they're different implementations, and you can actually use Redux without React. Okay, you can use it in other JavaScript libraries. You can use it just with vanilla JavaScript. You can use it anywhere. So it doesn't have anything to do with React. It just plays really nicely with React. Okay, it's simply just a lightweight state container, a library that provides a lightweight state container that kind of forces us into this specific pattern and makes our lives a little bit easier when dealing with complex state. Okay. So complex, that's kind of when I say complex state management, complex is kind of a keyword here, a keyword to think about. A lot of the time Redux is overkill. Redux and maybe even other state management libraries, a lot of time they're overkill in our applications. Dan, the author of Redux, he said that if you don't know whether or not you need Redux in your application, you probably don't. The same idea can kind of be applied to Redux and any other state management. If you don't know whether or not you need to install it and use it, you probably don't. Okay, because it's a complex state management library. If you have simple state, if you don't have any complex state, you probably don't need to go to the trouble of setting this all up. Okay, you'll know when you need it because you'll be struggling to keep your state organized, and you'll be struggling to send data to all your components and so on and so forth. So Yeah, you'll definitely know when you need it. And when you need it, hopefully you'll have the skills to implement it. It's also good to think about maybe how your app is going to scale in the near future. Maybe your app is going to be really simple right now when you first start, but if you want your app to be scalable without a ton of work, maybe you start with Redux as just kind of a short-term investment, right? You invest the time into building your application with Redux, even if it's simple to start with, because you know that eventually it's going to grow into something that's a little bit more complex. So you kind of just have to take it on a project by project basis and to say, okay, is this project worth it to implement something like Redux? If it's not, maybe we can move one step down and just use reducers. Okay, maybe that's even a little bit too complicated and we can just use context. Maybe that's a little bit too complicated and you can just use state, right? Just on a project by project basis that we need to decide what's the best thing to use for this project and how complex is this going to get over time. So that's what Redux is. It's just a library that helps us with complex state management. It's a library, but it's also kind of a pattern that we follow, that the library forces us into. All right, so Redux kind of helps us when we're working in complex applications. It helps us keep our state predictable and consistent. So why do you think it's important for our state to be predictable and consistent? Why is that important? Yes, it prevents migraines. Absolutely. Debugging purposes, so we're not surprised by side effects. Lessens bugs. Really, yeah, it comes down to that, to preventing bugs and making our app more scalable. Okay, something that you'll find when you're building applications that are being used by real people. Real people do crazy things when they're dealing with your apps. Okay, they're going to click on weird things. They're going to do unexpected actions. They're going to type weird stuff into inputs. They're going to have old, outdated browsers. They just kind of do weird things that you wouldn't necessarily expect or plan on. And this can result in inconsistent or unpredictable state, which is really, really difficult to debug, because in order for us as developers to reproduce that issue and figure it out and fix it, we have to mimic the exact state that user was in at the time. Okay, and that's really, really difficult to do, to mimic that current state that the user was in. If they're doing crazy things and we don't necessarily know like what they're clicking on or how they're getting to certain states, that's when it gets really difficult to find those bugs. Okay, so state bugs are really difficult to find and fix. So when we use Redux as a library and as a pattern, it kind of helps our state be way more predictable and manageable. Okay, it's a lot more difficult for a user to get into an unpredictable state. So Redux is a library that helps with complex state management. It's not as scary as it sounds. The truth is, if you understood the last lecture last week about reducers and actions and immutability, if you understood all of that, you pretty much already know Redux. Okay, you understand it already. It's really not much more than what we learned last week. Essentially, it's based on 3 core concepts. So Redux is based on 3 core concepts. The first concept is the concept of the store. Okay, the concept of the store, essentially all of the state in our application, every single piece of state is going to be represented in just a single JavaScript object. Okay, just one global giant object that contains all of the state for our application. That's referred to as the store. Okay. So it's based on one global state object that's called the store. And then you have reducers, or the pure functions that are responsible for updating our state or updating our store based on actionable objects, right? These action objects that have a type and a payload. And then our state object, our store, is immutable. Okay, so when changes are made, we don't ever change the state directly, but we we go through a reducer, which then clones the state object, modifies the clone, and replaces the original with the modified clone. We never mutate the state directly. Okay, this is Redux. So really the only new concept we have to worry about is this concept of a global state object, right? A store. It's a single source of truth for any kind of data in our application, any kind of state that's changing over time. So in this diagram, this kind of just explains Redux, the flow of Redux. What would the UI be? When we look at this UI piece, what would you consider that to be in our application? Yasir takes the cake. The UI in this flow is React. Okay, so remember Redux doesn't have anything to do with React. Redux plays nicely with React, but it really doesn't have anything to do with React. So you could take this piece right here and you could move it to a different application where the UI is maybe something different. Maybe the UI is Angular or Vue or some other JavaScript library. It would still work just the same. The pattern is still the same. Okay, so in this case, the UI is going to be React, and then the actions, the reducers, and the stores are going to be Redux. Okay, it's important to know that Redux is not specific to React. Awesome. So that's really the overall concept of Redux. It's not any more complicated than that. There's a lot of really great resources that you can dig into if you're still confused about Redux or any piece of this flow after the lecture tonight. The first one I would recommend is, I think Danielle actually posted a link in the PT8 channel to an egghead tutorial. That is definitely a good resource if you're interested in learning more. Actually, where is it? I think they have a link in the training kit. Ah, yes. So if you're still confused about Redux after tonight, check out this video and this tutorial series. And also I would highly recommend this cartoon intro to Redux. Okay, it's just a Medium article. It's about a 10-minute read. Look into that as well. Okay. Any questions so far? How difficult is it to transition? This is a question. How difficult is it to transition from managing state via other React ways to managing state via Redux? Have you gone through it? Yes, I have gone through it, and it's actually not that bad. It's not as bad as you would think. It's easier to transition from very simple state management into something more complicated like Redux. It's easier to do that than it is to go backwards. Okay, it's easier to implement Redux later on down the road than it is to remove it if you feel like it's a little bit too complicated. So it's probably best to start out with the basics, and then as your app grows, as you feel like you need to scale your state a little bit more, as it gets more complex, you can start to implement more complex state machines like Redux. All right, any other questions before we move forward? You guys actually lucked out, because before, when we used to teach Redux, we used to teach pretty much everything we're teaching tonight, plus the lecture that we had last week about actions and reducers. We kind of pushed that all into one single lecture. And it was really overwhelming because you kind of just had to learn everything all at once. But now that we already know about reducers and we already know about actions, Redux really isn't that much more, okay? You add on the global state, okay, yeah. But other than that, it's still the same idea. question. Can I use Redux if I don't have complex data just in case I may need it in the future? Yep, absolutely. You know, remember how I said you kind of just have to be smart about your planning, right? You have to think about your application. You got to think about how it's going to scale in the future. Maybe if you're building an application and it has the potential to take off and become really popular, if you think that there's a possibility that might happen, it might make sense to make the initial time investment of building Redux into your application from the get-go so that it's ready to go when you need to scale it, right? So you just kind of have to take it on a project by project basis. If you're just building a super simple app that you know is probably never going to get that popular, it's not going to get that complex, you can just keep it simple. Don't even worry about Redux, just use basic state. Right? Redux is really meant for complex web applications, for scaling very, very large web applications that deal with a lot of state data. All right. We're going to jump right into Code Sandbox. So I'll send you the links. The IT Crowd is a great show. If you haven't watched The IT Crowd, you got to watch it. If you find British humor funny. If you don't find British humor funny, you might not like it, but it's hilarious. All right, so this is the project that we left off on last week. I added a couple things to it. I just added some styles, and I added a dark mode component, our favorite feature. It doesn't really do anything yet. Just a checkbox that you can check on and off. It doesn't do anything yet, but we're going to implement this with Redux tonight. And we're also going to convert everything that we've been using our use reducer hook with. We're going to convert all of that to Redux as well. So we started out with this application. It was just simple use state, remember? And then we converted it to use reducer hook, and now we're going to convert it to Redux as kind of a final overhaul. And I'm going to upload this file for you. This is the flow of Redux. So let's just jump right into it and get started. For the first step, let's create our global store object. So remember our store object, our global state, it's just one giant object with the state of our entire application in it. Okay, so it has any state value that any component or anything in our application will ever need. So since our state is global, where do you think the best place to instantiate it would be, or to create it? We could do it in app. Let's go even one step up from app, and let's do it in index. Since remember, Redux doesn't have anything to do with React, so we don't even have to create it within the context of React. We can just create it right in our index JavaScript file. So first thing, we obviously need to install the Redux dependency. It's just a JavaScript library, so we can just add dependency and just add Redux. Predictable state container for JavaScript apps. 14 million downloads. It's very popular. So add Redux, and then we're gonna import from Redux. So let's import something called create store from Redux. This is going to allow us to create a global store that's hooked up to our reducers. So if you remember, we created our reducers in this reducers folder, and then we had a title reducer. It's just exporting our reducer function, and it's got some initial state that it's exporting as well. Well, when we create our global store, all we have to do is call create store and pass it our reducer. So let's create a variable, we'll call it store, and just say create store. It's going to be a function, we just pass it our reducer. And then make sure you import the reducer. From reducers / title. So you notice that it doesn't take initial state. We had our reducer, but we also have some initial state. The create store doesn't take initial state. So how do you think we should, what's the best way to instantiate our state with our initial value if we can't pass that to create store? What's an alternative way we could do that? Anybody know? Good, Yasir. Yeah, we can actually, and Raymond, we can just assign this variable as the default value to state. So if reducer gets called without any state, we can just use the initial state. Just say equals initial state. And then we don't have to export it anymore because it's not used outside of this file. We'll fix that error later. All right, so now we have this global store that's created with our reducer. Won't action need to be the first argument? Nope, because action is also optional. You don't have to define an action, although it will throw an error if you don't, because you're depending on action.type. But when the reducer gets called, the state is always going to be the first parameter. Okay, so now we have our global store. We haven't done anything with React yet. This is just Redux. So now we've created this essentially just a global JavaScript object that contains our initial state, and it also contains our reducer function. Okay, and it kind of hooked everything together in the background. So now we need to figure out how to use this Redux store within the context of React. Or we have to figure out how to hook it up to our React component. So there's actually there's another library that we can install that allows us to use Redux and React together. Can anybody guess what that library is called? That's a tough one. It's called React-Redux. So go ahead and install React-Redux. And this is going to allow us to hook up our Redux store to our React application. All right, so let's import something from React Redux called provider. This is a component called provider from React-Redux. Sounds familiar, right? Provider. How do you think we use this provider component? What do you think that is? Yeah, this is just a higher order component, right? This is a component given to us by React Redux that we can now wrap our entire application in. So instead of rendering just plain old boring app, we can now render app wrapped in our provider component. All right, it's just a higher order component. And it allows us to send through one prop. Anybody guess what that prop is? Store. Okay, it lets us give this store, give our generated store to that higher order component. And we have now installed Redux in our application. That's literally all it takes. Okay, and it's hooked up our reducer to Redux, and it's hooked up our initial state, and it's gotten everything ready to go. So I'm actually gonna just fix this really quick. Re-export that initial state so I can show you. If you open up the application now, if you have React DevTools installed, jump over into your DevTools, and you'll see that we now have our app component wrapped in this provider component, which has something called context.provider. Interesting, right? That looks a little bit familiar. So React Redux is actually using the context API under the hood for us. So just like we were using the use reducer hook and we were passing through maybe like the dispatch function and the state, we were passing that to context so that we could access it in deeply nested components. I don't know if any of you tried that during the assignment or during something else. That's exactly what React Redux is doing. It just does it under the hood for us. Okay, it uses the context API to basically pass our global state through to every component that wants to access it, to any child consumer. Okay, so React Redux is just built on the context API. All right, questions so far? So will Redux replace reducers? No, reducers are still essential to the flow of Redux, right? There's still a piece in that diagram, in that flow. Reducers are the only way to change our state. So you still have to use reducers when you're using Redux. I thought reducer takes the state or initial state, not the other way. Yep, you're right, whoever asked that. So the reducer takes the initial state or the current state. When the reducer gets called, it either gets the current state, or if the current state is empty, it sets some initial state values. If we're using router as well, would that go inside of the provider component? Yep. This is just an HLC, so now you can do router inside of that if you want. You can nest stuff however you want, okay? All right, let's take a 5-minute break, let all of the sink in, catch up, and I'll see you in 5. All right, come on back. So now that we have Redux installed, we can now connect our individual components to this global store. Now that we're providing that global store through the provider, right? The parent is providing it to all of its children. The children can now connect to that Redux store to display those values within the component itself. All right, take a look at these charts. So this would just be like a fairly complex component tree. So if we just had like a root app.js and then it had a bunch of children components and some of those components had children components. And let's say this foo value and the bar value are state values. Okay, so previously in order to use those state values throughout that component tree, you'd have to go to the lowest common parent of the component that relies on that value, the lowest common parent with other components that rely on it, and define the state in that component. Right? So in order to get those values down to lower levels in that component tree, you'd have to do prop drilling or use the context API or something like that. Okay, this is what it would look like if you were using prop drilling. You'd have to pass those values down from app.js through that component tree all the way down to the components that relied on those values. Okay, like in this case, even though this component here doesn't care about the value of bar, it still has to pass that through, it has to pass that prop through to its child. Okay, this is how we would access these state values with prop drilling. So potentially, even when we're using like the component composition pattern, or sometimes even when we're just using the context API, we don't always have the state values at the very top of the tree. Okay, let's say that these two components right here share a state value that nothing else in the application relies on. Then the lowest common parent in this case would be this component, right? And that's where you would define the state. That's still problematic because then you have a lot of different components throughout your app that are defining state, and it can be hard to track down state changes because you're not quite sure where that state is stored. You kind of have to traverse your component tree to find which component is storing that actual state value. All right, but now that we're using Redux, Redux uses a global state, just one single object for the entire application. We can now access our state this way, okay? So we define one global Redux state that's outside of the scope of React itself. That's where we define all of our state. And then any components that want to read those values or wants to consume those values, they just connect directly to that Redux store, okay, to that state. We no longer have to prop drill. We no longer have to decide which components should define state and which components should be pure. We just define one global state and that's it. Any component that needs those values just connects directly to that state. So you can see the benefits of this pattern already. We don't have to make the decision of where to store our state. It's already decided for us. What's the catch? The catch is it's a little bit more difficult to implement, to set up, but that's it. All right, so let's jump into our components and look at what it takes to actually consume these values from the state. So we've set up our state. Let's jump into our title component. So there's a function that comes from React Redux called connect. All right, it's exactly what it sounds like. So import connect from React Redux. And just like it sounds, this allows us to connect our component to our global Redux store. And the way that we use it is we just go all the way down to the bottom when we're exporting the component after it has already been created. And we just call connect as a function. So you're going to call it once, and then you're going to pass some parameters to it when you call it the first time. And then you're going to call it again and pass your component itself. Okay. This pattern of calling a function twice, this is actually called function currying. But it's essentially just when we call a function once and it returns a function as its result that we can then call again, okay? So looking at this, what would you consider connect, or the return value of this first call? What would you consider that? Or what would you call it? It's an HOC, right? It's essentially just an HOC. Connect is giving us a component that's going to wrap the title component. That's going to give us access to these values. All right, so the first parameter that we pass to connect takes a couple different parameters when we call it the first time. The first parameter is going to be something called, it's going to be a function that's called map state to props. Okay, that's just going to be a function. And we're going to pass it through as the first parameter to connect when we call it the first time, map state to props. And this function, it does one very, very simple thing. It gives us the global store. Okay, so it's going to give us the store as a variable, or you can call it state if that makes more sense, our global state. And then we simply just return an object from this function that allows us to take these state values, to choose which ones we want to pull from the global store, and assign some of these values to the component's props. All right, so let's say we wanted to pull, let's look at our state. We have the title value and the editing value. Let's just pull those two pieces out and assign them to variables in this object. So let's say title is going to be state.title, right? And editing is going to be state.editing. So this is assigning prop values to the component behind the scenes rather than us adding them manually through the JSX. Right, so it's saying when you create this component, pass through a prop value of title and assign it the value of title from the global state. And pass through a prop value of editing and assign it the global value of the state value of editing. So it's kind of allowing us to pick and choose which values from our global application state that we want to use in this specific component. All right, so now that we're doing this, we can actually get rid of a lot of our dispatch stuff that we had before. So let's instead of calling state.editing, remember we're pulling that from the user reducer state before, instead of saying state.editing, what do you think we can change that to? And state.title. Yep, since we're now using props, we're not pulling it from state, but we're just pulling it from the raw components props. We can now just say props.editing and props.title. And then you want to make sure you define props as a parameter in the title component, right? And that's it. We are now connected to our global Redux store, and we're pulling these values out and we're assigning them to the component's props. So now if these values ever change in our global Redux store, it's going to re-render this component with the new values automatically for us. If we look at the Redux or the React Dev Tools now, let's look at the title component. You'll see it's connected, or the title component under the context provider. You see we now have these props of editing, false, and title, the reducer pattern. And it's pulling it from context, right? It's pulling it from the context API, but it's doing it behind the scenes so that instead of working with the context API directly, we're just working with Redux. But it's the same idea under the hood. It's pulling these prop values out of context. And behind the scenes, it assigns them as props to the component. You'll see we also have a dispatch prop. That's new. Right, remember that dispatch was coming from our use reducer hook, but now it's coming through props. So instead of calling dispatch just raw from these calls, instead of just calling dispatch that comes back from that hook, we can just call props.dispatch. And that's a dispatch function that's hooked up already to our Redux store, to the global state. All right, so we can now get rid of our use reducer call. We can get rid of our reducer import. We can get rid of our use reducer import. Cleans up a lot of stuff here. Oh, and then we're calling state.title here. We can just change that to props.title. All right, and that should continue to work as it did before. Except this time we're going through that global Redux store instead of state that's local to this component. All right, what is dispatch? Remind me really quick, what's dispatch doing when we call it? This has the same functionality as the dispatch we were calling before. It just comes from a different place. Right, it's essentially dispatching an action, right? It kicks off some kind of a state change. You can kind of think of it like a 911 dispatcher, okay? You call 911 and the dispatcher is gonna answer the phone. You're gonna tell them what's going on. You're gonna tell them what's wrong, right? You're gonna give them some kind of an action. You're gonna say, type being burglarized or something, right? That would be your action type. You're gonna send that to the dispatcher and the dispatcher is gonna take that action and it's gonna figure out what to do with it, right? It's gonna send it to the reducer. It's gonna send that through the reducer function and the reducer is saying, oh, okay, so the person's being burglarized, that's the action type. Maybe we need to dispatch some police officers or some law enforcement to their house. So it's going to return some new state that shows that the law enforcement was dispatched. It's going to send that new state down to the component, and the 911 dispatcher is going to say, all right, the police is on their way. You're good to go. So the dispatch function, it's literally just taking an action and it's figuring out how to change the state based on that action, right? It's kicking off some kind of a state change. When we call the dispatch function, when we call props.dispatch, it's the same as like dialing 911, okay? Yeah, maybe the project should be emergency themed. That would be interesting. All right, questions so far? Whatever key values in my initial value are supposed to be in map state to props, or just the needed keys values. Just the needed ones. So when you call map state to props, you don't have to do every single value in your state. You're just picking and choosing specific pieces of your state that you want to use in this component. All right, and you define the prop name by just defining this key. If you wanted to change this to maybe is editing instead of just editing, you could define it as is editing, and it pulls from the state value of editing. And then when you use it, you call props.isEditing instead of .editing. So you can name the props whatever you want. You're essentially just pulling values from your state, you're deciding what to name them, and then you're returning an object, and Redux behind the scenes, or React Redux, takes care of translating this object into props for your component. Why then create store taking reducer in index.js? So create store, the first parameter is always just going to be a reducer. Okay, we have to pass some kind of a reducer to our create store. That's just how the API works for React Redux. So since our state is held at the top level, when state updates, it will re-render the entire app. Will this cause performance issues? Great question, Cliff. And the answer is no, it will not cause performance issues because React is smart enough to know that it doesn't need to re-render application or re-render components that aren't depending on state that changes. So maybe if title changes in this case, it's going to know to re-render the title component because we're depending on that value. But if there's some other state value that we're not picking out of this state object when we map our state to props, if there's some other state value that changes, since we're not using it in title, React knows that title should not be re-rendered, and it doesn't re-render it. All right, so React is smart enough to know when to re-render stuff and when to not re-render stuff, as long as we follow its predefined patterns. How does props get access to dispatch? That's something that this connect function does for us. Okay, when we use connect through React Redux, it'll automatically give us access through our props to the dispatch function. Okay, that's just built-in functionality that comes with React Redux, and it allows us to dispatch stuff from our component. Otherwise, we would have no way to change our state, right? You have to have some kind of access to that dispatch function. So that just comes automatically through the connect function. So it's just getting state from the reducer? No, it's not getting state from the reducer. It's getting state from the global store, right? When we create the global store, the reducer kind of defines that initial state, but that's not where it's stored. Okay, the initial state is just, or the reducer is just a pure function. The initial state is stored in this variable, this store variable. Okay, and that store variable gets passed to our provider and in turn, any of our consumers. Can you please go over what you just did in the previous code if possible? Whoever asked that, I don't know what piece you're referring to. Remember to be specific in your questions because I don't always see them right away. So we might move on to a different piece after you've already asked your question. So I might not know what you're referring to. All right. We are on track. We're doing well here. So this pattern kind of forces us into, it forces us even further into a more immutable state, right? Since all of our state now comes through props. Remember, props are read-only. We cannot change, we can't change props. The only way to change props is to go through some kind of a setter function that comes through the parent, right? In this case, the only way to change our prop values that come from Redux is to call a dispatch function. And dispatch only accepts an action object, right? We can't change our state directly. We have to dispatch an action in order to change our state. So that forces us into that flow. Remember that diagram that I showed you? It forces us into that flow of any state changes have to go through an action and a reducer, and the reducer changes the state, and then the state comes back down to the view. And it kind of just forces us into this circular flow of anytime we want to change state, we have to go through an action first. Okay, so now our state changes are completely predictable. They're predefined. It's almost impossible for a user to enter an unpredictable state because we're basically dictating what kind of state changes can happen and when. All right, so let's take a look at the overall flow of our application so far. Okay, so we've got some global state that was created. We created our global store through the create store function. We passed in a reducer. So our global state is created, and then it's connected to our children components through the provider component that comes from React Redux. So when we create our provider component, we have to give it some kind of context, right? Because it uses context behind the hood or behind the scenes under the hood. So we give it the context of our global store, our global state object. And then any kind of component that needs those values just connects to them through the connect function. So now we're connected to that global Redux store. We can pull those values out of the state, assign them to props, and just use them like normal props. Okay, and then let's say some kind of action happens, some kind of user interaction, they click on a button, or do something, they change the title, that's going to trigger one of these event handlers to run, which in turn dispatches a new action, right? So it's going to dispatch one of these actions of update title or toggle editing. And that's in turn going to kick off a state change. So it's going to send that action that we define in dispatch. It's going to send that to our reducer function. Okay, our reducer is then going to receive the current state from Redux, that global state object, and it's going to receive the action that we sent. It's going to make a change to the state based on the action that we sent it. It's going to return a new cloned modified state. And then that new state in turn gets passed back down through the provider and to all of the children components that are relying on those values. Okay. Remember to update your poll as to how you're feeling about tonight's content as we move along. This concept of this whole flow and this concept of Redux, it's going to click for some of you right away, but for some of you it might take a little bit longer to click. That's okay. Just don't stress out about it. Just take your time. Look over the flow of Redux, read articles, watch tutorials. It will click for you sooner or later. Actually, when I first learned Redux, it took quite a while for the whole concept to click with me, because the whole concept of one-way data flow is still new in the developer community. So just take the time to let it click in your head, mess around with it, read articles, and it will click for you eventually, just the whole flow and the pattern. Remember, this pattern is not specific to React. Okay, this pattern is used in a lot of different frameworks. So it's valuable even if you're not going to be working in React when you get a job. It's valuable to know this pattern. It's just a computer science pattern, a mathematical pattern. It's used in a lot of different places. So notice how this is kind of tedious and verbose, how things, or how we're calling our dispatch function and how we're passing through actions. If we had a ton of different action types and we were dispatching a bunch of different things, it could get really tedious and verbose in our code. It can muddy up our code and get very, very messy very quickly. Dispatching actions like this, just manually writing out the action as a string, it's not very dry, right? We see we're calling toggle editing twice and we have to repeat this code every time, and it's kind of tedious. Okay, so Redux actually introduces another concept called action creators. So this isn't complex. This is just a really simple idea on top of what we've already learned. But essentially, action creators are just pure functions that we can call that will basically return one of these action objects. Okay, it's going to return this action object or the update title action object. It's just a pure function that returns an action object. That's it. Okay. The only thing is when we use action creators, instead of just calling actions manually like we're doing currently, they allow us to, or they essentially allow our actions to be more dynamic, right? They allow us to create our actions on the fly by passing like maybe different parameters to the function rather than hard coding the action itself like we're currently doing. So it helps a lot with reusability and with drying up our code a little bit. Yes, kind of like it's kind of the same idea as enums Bradley, but a little bit different, but you get the idea. So let's change this code a little bit so we use action creators instead of just calling dispatch directly. So let's create a new folder in source. We're going to call it actions. And inside of actions, let's create a new file and call it title. It's going to be the title actions. All right, so with the idea that an action creator is just a function that returns an action type or an action object, how do we create an action creator function for our toggle editing action type? Type it into Slack. What do you think? How can we create an action creator for this type? All right, Cole, you're getting a little bit ahead of us here. So that's when we want to make our action type variables, or our action types variables instead of strings. But remember, an action creator is just a pure function. So let's just export a function from this file, just a pure function. We can call it toggle editing. Okay, this is just a pure function. And all it does is it returns an object type. Good, Ruth. It's just going to return our object, or an action. I think I said object type, I meant action. And that's it. That is an action creator. So now instead of calling props.dispatch with an object of type toggle editing, we can just call the toggle editing function. All right, let's try doing the same thing with our update title type. This one's going to be a little bit different because it takes a parameter, right? It takes a payload. But it's still just as simple. It's just a pure function. We can export a new function, call it update title. And this one is going to take a parameter. We can just call it title. One parameter of the title. And it's going to return an action object of update title. And then the payload, instead of the value that's currently there, we can just say title. All right, those are our action creators. So now if we want to dispatch one of these actions from within our title component, all we have to do is import them and send them through the connect function. So let's import both of these into title. Come to title, come to the top. Then we'll import toggle editing and update title. We're going to import those from /action/title. Okay, we can now import those action creators directly. I'm not sure why I'm getting, oh, I might have a typo there. It's hard to tell. There we go. All right, now this brings us to the second parameter on our connect function. So our first parameter is map state to props. Okay, we're simply mapping some of the global state to our component's props. The second parameter is going to be something called map dispatch to props. Okay, this one's a little bit different, but it's the same idea. It's going to pass us the dispatch function that we were using before. Okay, we were using that dispatch, remember, just from the props. Well, this map dispatch to props function gives us access to that dispatcher. And then we can return a new object, and whatever we return from this object is going to get assigned as props to our component. So we can basically predefine our dispatch calls just once in this function without having to repeat them over and over and over again when we actually call them in the component. So we need two, right? We need one for update title and one for toggle editing. So let's return two values from this function. We'll say update title. And that's going to be a function that has the title, and it's going to call dispatch of the update title function that we imported with title. And then we need one for set editing as well. So we'll say set editing, and that doesn't have any props or any parameters. So we can just do a regular function and we can say dispatch set editing. Okay, this syntax is a little different, or toggle editing, I'm sorry, not set editing, toggle editing. The syntax is a little bit strange, but essentially what it's doing is it's taking our dispatch calls, right? These previous dispatch calls when we were calling props.dispatch and then passing through an action object. Instead of doing that, we're now calling dispatch here. And instead of passing through a raw action object, we're calling our action creator. Okay, the action creators that we imported. And those action creators, when they get called, they return action objects, right? And then we're assigning those functions to props on the component. So we can call these key values, we can call them whatever we want. We could call this update and this editing, okay? We can call them whatever we want. The only thing is whatever we call them, that's what they get passed to the component as, or that's what the prop name is. All right, so if we want to change the title now, let's say we wanted to call update title. Instead of calling props.dispatch with the update title action type, we can now just call props.update title. Okay, and then we have to send through the payload as a parameter. And that's going to do the same thing as calling props.dispatch, except it's much more reusable and dry. Okay, I know the syntax is a little weird. You're definitely going to have to practice, but you'll get it. It'll click for you. All right, there's no magic to these functions here. They're simply taking these values that are given to us, the state and the dispatch function, and they're allowing us to basically assign props behind the scenes to our component with access to these values. So access to a piece of state, or access to the dispatcher function, or access to something from our Redux store. Okay, and then we just assign the prop values by defining keys in this object that gets returned. That's it. And then obviously for map dispatch to props, we pass it through as a second parameter to our connect function. Yep, Vlad, you have to pass that through. So if we were to replace our props.dispatch call for toggle editing, what do we need to do to mimic that functionality? How do we call that function now? Yeah, we call it through props dot whatever you named it when you returned the object. Okay, so we named it toggle editing right here, whatever you named the key, but you could name it whatever you want. So we're going to say props dot whatever you named the function, toggle editing. Okay, and now just like up here in the handle edit function, we're still using props.dispatch. Instead of having to repeat that whole thing with that hard-coded action, we can now call props.toggleEditing again. We no longer have to manually define our action objects every time we call those actions. Okay, that's the beauty of Redux right there. It's all about this reusability, this dry code that we can pass through to our components just through props. And it makes our code a lot more concise and easier to reason through. You could destructure the props, Nick, if you wanted to. Totally optional. If it makes it easier for you to read, then yes, you can do that. These are just props, right? You can do anything you do with props and other components. You can destructure them. You can write ternaries with them. You can do anything you want. They're just props. All right. Any other questions before we move forward? What kind of methods / tools do you use to map out the architecture of your app? Pen and paper, Nick? Can never go wrong with just mapping something out on a piece of paper or maybe a whiteboard. But it always benefits you to plan the architecture or the layout of your files, to just basically think about your application and plan things out before you start writing code. It'll always help. Is that really an NPM package? I'm a big fan of writing stuff on paper. I don't know why. Just, it's nice to get away from the screen for a little while when you're planning stuff, when you're planning architecture. Whiteboards, yeah. All right, make sure you update your poll. How are you feeling? We're at a 3.2 right now. It's not too bad. Give yourself some time to let this sink in. Let's take a 5-minute break, and I'll see you in 5. Come on back. Come back to me. Any questions? Sarah, you can always refresh the code sandbox and to get all the updated code. Keep that in mind. Maybe you keep like your fork open in one tab and the live sandbox in another tab, and you can just refresh it when you need it. Cool. All right, how are we feeling? I know this is a lot to take in, so deep breaths, take it slow. Cool. So there's actually something we can do to make this map dispatch to props function a little bit more concise, easier to write. I wanted you to write all this out just so you understood what it was doing under the hood. But little secret, you can actually just define an object instead of a function. And whatever you send through to that object, it will map the dispatch to it automatically. So we can just say update title and toggle editing. And that's a lot more concise than calling that dispatch method manually. But it's very important to know what that's doing under the hood. Okay. So our app should still work just the same as it did before, except this time we are using Redux instead of the use reducer hook. Don't be mad. It's good for you. So now instead of calling dispatch manually, we're kind of working in a much more functional way. Okay. Redux is kind of hooking everything up for us, and we're just calling these simple functions to kick off our state changes. So now, even if we had 100 different dispatch methods in one event handler, it wouldn't be that bad because they're just functions, right? You understand exactly what they're doing when you look at them. They're easy to call. You don't have to define action types every single time. They're just easy to call functions. How does that work? Well, behind the scenes, when you define an object instead of a function that has dispatch, when you just define an object, behind the scenes, React Redux will do this. They'll just return an object with that key and call that function with the dispatch method. Just does that behind the scenes for you when you define an object. And remember, this calling just an object with one value instead of a key value is the same as just calling update title with the value of update title. If the key and the value are the same, you can only define it. You can leave out the second call and only define it once. Okay, that's just basic JavaScript ES6 syntax. All right, so imagine we had 100 different action types, okay, and 100 different action creator methods. It's not going to be that bad in our component itself, right? Because we're just calling these functions that are mapped to our props, and it's pretty straightforward. But imagine it within the context of our action creators and our reducers. Okay, especially between our action creator, our action objects and our reducers. We essentially have to define like this string when we're defining our action type. We have to define that string several times. Okay, and let's say we had 100 different action creators and 100 different action types. It would be really, really, really easy to misspell one of those action strings, one of those type strings. Okay, so let's say, for example, in one of our, let's say in our reducer, we accidentally misspell update title and we say update tile instead. Okay, save that and look at what happens on your page. try and edit your title, hit save, and it didn't actually work. It didn't update the title, right? And we get no error from React. We get nothing. It just doesn't work. Okay, it's just a completely transparent bug. There's no error. And that can be extremely difficult to debug something like this, especially in a large application. Okay, if you have 100 different reducer types or 100 different types and you're reducing through all of them and you misspell one of them and something's not working, you have to go through each one of them and make sure there's no typo, right? There's no typo debugger when it comes to strings. JavaScript doesn't care how your string is spelled. Okay, so this is a big problem in our current implementation. So there's actually a way to fix this that's really straightforward. Instead of using hard-coded strings as our types, we can change it to just variables, constant variables. This is a pattern that's extremely common in not only Redux, but any kind of application, any kind of programming. You'll notice how when we define our action type, we define it as snake case, all caps. There's actually a reason for that, because when we define constant variables, it's what's the word? Can't think of the word. It's convention. Okay, it's convention to name our constant variables all caps with underscores. Okay, it's tradition. Yeah, convention is the word I was looking for. So inside of our action, in our action file, when we're defining our types, instead of using these strings, we can now define constant variables, and we can say const toggle editing is going to be the name of the variable, and the value is just going to be that string. Okay, this is a constant variable. It's just a variable that stores a string, and that's it. And it's convention to make them all caps. So now instead of using a string, when we actually use that type, we can use the constant variable. Okay, and we can also export it so other files can use that constant variable. Let's do the same thing with the update title. Export const update title equals update title, just a string. And then we can use that constant variable instead of the string when we define a type. So now let's jump into our reducer and import those action types. So now we can import toggle editing and update title, import both of those from our action file, from actions title. And we can now use those constant variables instead of the strings in our reducer. So we can say case toggle editing and case update title. All right, so now look what happens when we actually have a typo in one of our action types. If we misspell update title and we say update title instead, we now get an error because that variable is undefined. Okay, so instead of using a hard-coded string where we wouldn't get an error, we now get an error because that variable is undefined. So instead of that transparent error, instead of nothing happening except for our app just breaking when we misspell something, we get an actual error that tells us where the error actually occurred, where the typo occurred. Okay, this is a convention that's used in all of programming. This isn't just JavaScript, it's not just React, but any kind of language. When we define strings as variables, it prevents typos when we reuse them over and over again. All right, questions. This is Redux. All right, there is nothing more to it than this. This is it. This pattern of it's kind of forcing us into that flow, right? Our UI is connecting to action creators. Action creators return action objects, which use the hard-coded action types. They get dispatched to the reducer. the reducer returns some new cloned, edited state. That new state gets passed through to our components, and the cycle continues on and on as long as our application runs. Okay, this is Redux. So no matter how large our application now becomes, if we start to get tons and tons of action types, action creators, if we have 1,000 action creators and 1,000 types, it's still really easy to maintain because we're forced into this pattern of immutability. Okay, so every time we get a new action type and some kind of a new piece of state, we just add stuff to the reducer, we just add some action creators to our file, and we don't have to worry about the actual implementation in our state, right? We just consume it, or in our component, excuse me. We don't have to worry about the actual implementation in our component because we just consume those values as props. All right, this is Redux. Can we define those strings as variables directly in reducer instead of actions? Yeah, you can define them anywhere you want. It doesn't really matter where you define them. It's convention, again, common practice to define them alongside the action creators, because they're kind of like when you're creating an action, you're kind of creating an action type in the same file, they're similar, but you can define those variables wherever you want. Okay, the overall pattern, the whole flow of Redux is very, actually once you grasp it, it's not that difficult. But I think the more difficult part is the implementation, right? Remembering all the syntax of what the functions do, how everything maps together. That can be the difficult part. So once you actually dive into the code and start coding stuff with it, I think it'll make a lot more sense. That's awesome, Rose. Can you provide us with a map of the data flow through this project? I don't have one right now, but I mean, if we look at the, whoops, if we look at the flow, so this action, okay, this spot when we're dispatching an action, where does this take place in our application? Where does this step take place? Takes place in the event handlers, right? When we call props dot some kind of action, that's this step right here. We're dispatching an action. Okay, where does this step take place? This arrow, when the action gets sent to the reducer, where does that take place in our application? Kind of a trick question. It takes place through dispatch, right? That arrow is the dispatch. But in our case currently, since we're just passing it through React Redux and this map dispatch to props object, it's kind of just happening transparently behind the scenes, right? We no longer call dispatch manually. So that process of sending the action to the reducer, that's kind of happening just behind the scenes automatically for us when we call one of our action creators. Okay. What about our reducer step? Obviously, that's pretty obvious as to where that is, right? If you look in our title file, our reducer, that's right here. Our reducer is going to return some new state. That's this right here. That's this arrow. It's going to return some new state, a new store, completely new store, right? It cloned the existing store and it changed something in it and returned a new one. And then where does this occur? How does the store get sent back to the user interface? How does it get sent back to the component? Through the provider, right? It gets sent back through the provider as a prop, and the provider then in turn, using the context API behind the scenes, provides it to any component that's currently connected to the Redux store via the connect function. Nice. So question, Nick, is it convention to break up large apps with multiple reducer action components? Yep, that is convention, and we're going to do that for our last 12 minutes. All right, so let's do that as our last step. Let's implement our dark mode by using another reducer and another action creator and hook it all up to the Redux store. So let's jump into let's create some actions first. So jump into your actions folder. Let's create a new file. Let's call it theme.js because dark mode is kind of just related to our theme, right? Okay, what's an action type that we can define as a constant? Let's export a constant. What do you think we should call it for toggling our dark mode? You wouldn't say toggle theme necessarily because the theme could be a lot of different values. We're talking about one value in specific, right? Dark mode. So let's just call it toggle dark mode. That's going to be our action type, dark mark mode equals, and then the string of toggle dark mode. Or light mode, yeah, you could call it either. All right, what about our action creator? What should we call our action creator function? Anybody? What should we call our action creator function? Toggle dark mode, sounds good to me. Do we need any parameters for this one? Nope, because we're just toggling between a Boolean value, right? It's either true or false. So we need to return a new action object. And we can just say type toggle dark mode. Yep, exactly, Stephen. Venki, we're not in the reducer yet. We haven't created the reducer. This is just the action creator. Okay, we're working with the action creator and the action type first, and then we're going to jump in and create the reducer. Yeah, definitely get used to typing underscores, Nick. You'll use them a lot. All right, let's create our reducer now. I wish I could split this vertically. Split down, there we go. All right, so let's create a new file in our reducers folder and call it theme.js. This can be our theme reducer. All right, so let's import our toggle dark mode. From our action file. Stretch that pinky. Actually, I think if you type correctly, you should type the underscore with your ring finger. I guess that would depend on your keyboard. Anyways. All right, let's define some initial state. What should our initial state be? Let's just say dark mode false. And then we need a reducer, right? So let's export function reducer. It's going to take a state, some state, and an action. We can use our initial state as a default value to our state parameter. Then we can switch over our action type. And we can say if the type is toggle dark mode, then let's return some new state. we're going to clone the existing state object, and we're going to assign the dark mode value to the opposite value of what it currently is. Okay. And then remember to have a default case. If the action type doesn't match anything, just return the state unchanged. All right, let's jump into our index file when we're creating our store. So remember, we're creating it from that title reducer. That's kind of considered our root reducer in this case. But since we have two reducers now, we have to do something a little bit different. We have to combine these two reducers into a single root reducer. Okay, and Redux actually has a really easy to use function that does that for us. It's just called combine reducers. So now when we define our store, we can define a root reducer, const root reducer, and just call that combine reducers function. Okay, and it's going to take an object. And now we can pass through our two different reducers to this object. Okay, so we can import reducer. Let's rename that variable by saying as title reducer, and then copy that line and do the same thing with our theme reducer. So now in our combined reducers, we're going to define some keys. So we can kind of give them namespaces, our reducers. So we're going to say title reducer, and theme reducer. And then instead of passing reducer to our create store, we're going to pass our new root reducer variable, our combined reducers. So this requires a few changes in our title component. Since now we're combining two reducers into one root reducer, it's more namespaced, right? Because now our title reducer stuff is under title, and our theme reducer stuff is under theme. So now inside of title, instead of calling in our map state to props, instead of calling just state.title and state.editing, we're now going to call state.title.editing, since it's under that title key, that title namespace, and state.title.title. Kind of weird there, but you get the idea. Okay. Ooh, we are running short on time, 4 minutes. Think we can pound this out in 4 minutes? I don't know. Okay, let's just do it really quick. If you fall behind, then you can just refresh it and get the code later. But we need to jump into this dark mode component, and we just need to connect it to the Redux store and then essentially map all those prop values together. Actually, I don't think we're going to have time to do this now that I think about it. I don't want to make you late to the assembly. Let's do this. While you're in the assembly, I'll write this out. I'll connect everything together, and then I'll send you a link. And then if you have any questions, I'll stick around for a while, and you can ask them just in this channel. I'll be around for a while. So let me do that, and then I'll get you guys to the assembly on time. Yeah, this lecture was recorded, so you can rewatch all of this, and then yeah, that's actually a good idea. We can just keep the recording going, and then you guys can jump out right now and jump into the assembly, and I'll just get this recorded, and then you can watch the recording afterwards. How does that work? You guys will just have to fill me in on what they talk about in the assembly. All right. So we're going to jump in. So you guys can go ahead and jump out and jump into the assembly. I'll keep going here. But have a good night, everyone, and I'll see you on Wednesday. Good luck with the assignment. All right, so I'm going to jump into the dark mode component. We essentially just need to connect this to our Redux store and pull that dark mode value out of our theme, out of the theme piece of the reducer, or the theme namespace of the reducer. Okay, because we combined them with this combined reducers. Our theme reducer is now under theme. So we can connect to that Redux store and pull stuff out of that kind of that namespaced piece of the reducer of the global store. So let's jump into the dark mode component and let's import connect from React Redux. All right, and we're going to call connect when we export it. We're going to call connect once and call it again and pass the component the second time. The first time we're going to pass our, remember our two parameter values, which are map state to props and map dispatch to props. We need to define those functions, those parameter values. So let's say map state to props. That's going to give us the global state. And remember, we just return an object from this function that will assign those values to our props based on the name. So now we can just say return an object, and we can say, we can call it whatever we want. We can just call it maybe enabled as to whether or not dark mode is enabled or not. And we can pull that value out of state.theme.dark mode. Okay, so that's going to pull the value of dark mode out of our theme state and assign it to the prop value of enabled. Okay, and you'll see we're already using, this component is already using props.enabled as the value for the checkbox. Cool, so now we need to, so you see it's also using props.toggle. So when you change the input field, it's going to toggle it should toggle that state value, so it should set it to something else. So remember, we have that action creator of toggle dark mode. We wrote that out in our theme action file, this toggle dark mode. So go ahead and just import that into your dark mode component. Let's import toggle dark mode from action/theme. And then we're going to assign it to that map dispatch to props. And remember, we can keep it simple by just defining an object and say toggle dark mode. All right, so this input is now connected to that props.toggle. When the input changes, it's going to call this action creator, which will then in turn send that action of toggle dark mode to the reducer, and the reducer will then in turn update the state based on the reducer. It's going to return some new state, and it's going to toggle the value of dark mode. And it's going to send that new dark mode value through to our application, through the provider. Okay, so instead of, well, actually not instead of, so we can go ahead and save that file. And now inside of, if you go into app.js, you see we already have a conditional class based on the prop of dark mode. We can now connect this app component to the Redux store and just use that value that came out of the Redux store, that dark mode value. So anytime it changes from the dark mode component itself, when that checkbox changes and it changes that value, the new value is going to persist down to all of the components that are relying on it. So if this app component is relying on that value, when the dark mode component changes it, this app component is going to receive that change as well. Okay, this is the beauty of Redux. So we can now import our connect function once again, import connect from React Redux. And let's export default, connect our app to the Redux store. We're going to define our map state to props. Once again, it's going to pass in some initial state, or not some initial state, our global store, so our global Redux store. We're going to return some props values, and you see we're relying on props.dark mode. Okay, so in our return object, let's just name our prop value dark mode. And we'll say state dot theme dot dark mode. And then we'll pass map state to props to our connect function. And make sure we don't have any typos. So let's try it out. It doesn't work. All right, let's figure out why it doesn't work. Probably because we didn't save our file. Save the file. Now let's see if it works. No? All right, let's see what we missed here. Oh, of course. So you see when we passed, so we passed a function value to our component called props or toggle dark mode. That would be the function name, toggle dark mode. But when we used it, we actually just called props.toggle. Okay, that's what it was already calling, props.toggle. So instead of passing through toggle dark mode, we have to assign it to a prop value of just toggle. Okay, and then we can pass the value of toggle dark mode to that function. Save that and try it out, and it now works. Okay, our dark mode now works. So you notice we can name our prop values whatever we want. They don't have to match the actual value that we're giving it. Okay, we can name these whatever we want as long as when we call props dot whatever it is, we call it by the correct name. All right, and another thing to notice inside of app, when we're calling connect, that map dispatch to props, that's completely optional. Okay, that parameter is optional. Since we're not actually manipulating or changing any data inside of our app component, we don't have to pass through that map dispatch to props parameter. We can just do the map state to props and call it good. All right. So that is it for those of you that are still here. Everything works okay. Hello world. Saves our new title. Our dark mode works, and everything is going through our single state tree, our single Redux state tree. All right. Someone asked, can we do this on Wednesday? Yeah, for those of you, I know everyone left, but we'll do a quick review of what I just did on Wednesday, if anyone still has questions. And Vlad, you asked, how does combine reducers work under the hood? That's a good question, actually. So when we combine our reducers, we're essentially giving some namespace. We're giving an object and we're saying under the title key, put our title reducers, and under the theme key, put our theme reducers. Behind the scenes, React Redux is just taking all of our reducers and combining them into one giant reducer. All right, so you notice when we create our action creators, we're not actually calling, we're not specifying like that namespace when we specify our type, our action type. Well, that's because combined reducers combines everything into one giant reducer. Okay, so even though we have separate reducers, we still have to have unique action type names because the end result is still just one giant reducer. Okay, that was for Vlad. All right, so hopefully that clears that up, and have a good night, everyone. I don't know who's still in here.